London Wine Fair people, it is epic to have you all joining us here today in what is to be a wine science panel to remember. My name is Sonny Hodge. I'm the author of the Cynic's Guide to Wine. Hermione, my publisher, has asked me to plug it. So this is the plugging moment. We're ready. We're in it. It is, I did it. You're very proud of me. Copies can be picked up over here. We have another crew member over there. Love it. How well orchestrated. Thank you. So it's the first in wine science literature to tie together the principles, the scientific principles from soil to fruit, onwards to production, and then to our sensory perception of that wine. So hopefully links it all together to give us a better understanding of how wine works. I also have 2 wine bars in London, one called Diogenes the Dog in Elephant and Castle, the other called Aspen and Merceau in Battersea, and I was the humble recipient of the London Wine Fair's Buyers Awards last year as well. So very thankful to be here with you today. In today's jam-packed session, we've only got 45 minutes, so we're going to have to blitz through this. It's geared around questioning wine. I'm joined by a panel of 3 wine experts, thank you so much for joining me, from differing fields to answer those questions in wine that we all struggle to get our heads around. Round 1, we'll start with a few burning questions that have been submitted before today's event, a little bit on social media, some from our wine bars mail shots. So they're burning questions on wine that have been asked already, but if anyone from the audience wants to ask a question in the middle, I rely on your interactions to keep this show going. So please pop your hand up. Someone will come around with a microphone. Round 2 will be a Q&A about anything in wine. So if there are any questions that you want to ask for this session, you can pop your hand up and we'll come around with a microphone, or you can scan the code that will come up to ask a question. As it's a scientific panel, I kindly ask you to keep your questions non-subjective. So what are your favorite questions, or what's the best questions would be politely batted away, because this is less about our personal individual opinions and more about how stuff works. Joining you today are Sigrid Gertsen-Schibbye, did I do it? Ish. Whose speciality is in microbiology and fermentation. Sigrid is a microbiologist at Lallemand. Her focus is on yeast, microbial activity, and their transformative role in fermentation and wine style development. Huge round of applause for Sigrid, everybody.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
I haven't done anything yet.
Next up, we've got Sietze Wijma, who specializes in aroma and sensory science. He has a master's in sensory science and is the founder of The Art of Tasting. He has an incredible Instagram channel that's at The Art of Tasting, which is well worth checking out. I've been a follower for a long, long time. Very geeky aroma science stuff, all geared around wine. So yeah, thank you so much, Sietze, for joining us. Another round of applause, please. And then finally, we have Luke Spalding. His forte is in regenerative viticulture and farming. He's the general manager and legendary viticulturist at the regeneratively farmed Everflyht Vineyard in East Sussex. He has a stand here, which is just over there. Well worth checking out and tasting Luke's wines. He's an innovator, a data lover, and a truly scientific force to reckon with. So thank you so much, Luke, for joining us today. I do also kindly ask you to note that this is a recorded session and it'll go out on YouTube later. So if you want to watch it or show it to your mates, please do follow me at Sonny Hodge Wine on Instagram. But you can check out this session later. So do keep your questions appropriate and purely scientific, please. To warm up your taste buds, before we crack on with round 1, what I ask you to do is scan the code. It should come up on your original QR code apps. You all have the same wine in front of you. give it a smell, smash into your iPhones what you smell. The major aromas are really what we're looking for. And as they're getting entered, they'll appear on the screen. And I'm gonna crack on with round one and ask Sietze the first question. So the first question is, if we're all smelling this glass of wine, are we all smelling the same thing?
The answer is obviously no. And I think you framed the question with how much of that is going to be culturally determined versus how much is biology. And what this nicely illustrates, and I think we can already see some aromas and flavors popping up. Partly is how sensitive you are to certain aroma compounds. And there is a fascinating phenomenon in flavor perception called specific anosmia, which Sonny has also written about. It's basically that you might be missing the receptor for a particular aroma that is found in wine. So in the human nose, we're equipped with about 400 different aromatic receptors. And it could well be that upon birth, you're missing one of them, or one of them is not functioning at all, resulting that you have certain blind spots towards a fragment of that smell that's popping out of the wine. So pepper, does that mean like multiple people have mentioned pepper? Or is okay, so that's great. That is caused by an aromatic compound known as rotundone. And that is an aromatic compound present in some wines, including Syrah and Grüner Veltliner, but also in peppercorns itself. However, that same compound is also present in sandalwood. And is also present in marjoram. And is also present in heather. Now, what do all of these things smell like? You might not know, because that is dependent on what you've been most exposed during your life, or what you've been most recently been smelling. If yesterday you were smelling some chips of sandalwood, it could well be that that's what you're picking up on that wine, because that's freshest in your memory, right? But I think I like that that's popping up, because that is also a character of rotundone.
Super. Thank you. Did anyone have any questions on that sensory analysis before we move on? All right. Sigrid, this is a bit of a controversial one for some reason, but what has more of an impact on your final wine? Is it the place of origin, so where those grapes have been grown, or is it the strain of yeast that the winemaker has selected to produce that wine?
That's a fantastic question, and I would have to say, in all my years, yeast, no. Far and away, it is a wine of place that takes the precedence. The yeast is really your best friend to help enhance that and give it more authenticity in terms of being one of the elements that can help. But in terms of, we did a trial on an international level where we had 9 different wines from 7 different countries that were produced with the same yeast. And then over the next few years, it was tasted as it evolved. So the only stipulation with this trial on an international level was the winemakers used the same yeast. And without a doubt, there was no uniformity, sort of Coca-Colization of it. There was true expression of each individual site, whether it was Australia, New Zealand, Oregon, South Africa, France, etc. So I think on that level, it can become it's a fun topic over a glass of wine, because there's a lot more to it. There's philosophical, etc. But yes, wine of place can be a strong point. Yeah.
Can I be the devil's advocate there? Because I feel like, suppose you're making a Sauvignon Blanc in the Loire Valley, and you're adding a yeast strain that's very efficient at releasing passion fruit aromas. I think you can probably produce something that completely tastes like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, but it's produced in the Loire Valley.
But the goal is to enhance those aromas. It doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes a carbon copy of the New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So even if passion fruit dominates, and that yeast is either genetically or through nutrients, etc., is able to produce a lot of that aroma, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be a carbon copy of a New Zealand, because there are so many other elements that would come in to make that a beautiful wine that has perhaps stronger aromas. But is that because New Zealand has managed to use different yeasts and nutrient regimes to make that distinctive New Zealand? That's another question. So that's why it's a good topic, and that's very good.
Sweet.
That's a question.
Tell me, or have we got a microphone somewhere? Love it.
So the question is, can you choose the wrong yeast? When we're choosing yeast, there's many elements that would come into that, but also if you have a spontaneous fermentation could come with a strain that is perhaps not as adequate as well in terms of bringing certain aromas forward. So whether you choose a yeast that is known for certain characteristics, or if you choose 3 different yeast on the same juice, and each one will bring a certain aromatic profile, all of those elements, I don't think you can choose the wrong yeast. The yeast will always do the best it can with the juice that it has there. So,
but suppose you're using a yeast strain that was developed to be efficient at releasing muscat aromas and flavors, like releasing a lot of rose flavors or bergamot flavors, for example, and you're adding that to a Sauvignon Blanc juice. What happens?
A new experiment.
Okay.
We have many winemakers who said we've had a red wine yeast and they've used it in white wines, etc. So it's not that. There is no one right answer, I think. And often there are some fantastic discoveries that have been made with a winemaker who decided that they really loved some of the characteristics in another wine and wanted to try it on something else. Where we've selected those strains from fantastic fermentations in different regions, will certainly bring in elements to a wine from a different area. But the yeast isn't going to make one thing taste exactly the same. It will always bring in elements from that. So
I think it's when science always reaches the fringes of our understanding, it becomes somewhat of a philosophical conversation. What'll be interesting from the room is maybe to have a show of hands up who feels that selecting specific yeast strains to accentuate desirable flavors would be contra our idea of terroir. Who would think that would be against our ideals? Show of hands. 1, 2, 3. Higher, just so I can vaguely count if that's okay. We got about a third of the room. Okay, and show of hands who thinks it's totally fine to select a strain of yeast to give us those flavors and aromas that we want. Okay, 2/3, the other 2/3. Love it. Interesting. Cool. Luke, question for you.
Yep.
Do conventional farming methods untangle our current idea of what terroir is?
I think you're going to go backwards if you're looking at it from a blank canvas. So even before the vineyard's through, you're actually starting to change the terroir when you establish the field.
Yeah.
So you're adding a different organism into that field that didn't have vines before. So straight away you're already changing that terroir of that ground.
Makes sense.
But yeah, conventional, especially modern day conventional, which seems to be heavily reliant on adding compost in, tons and tons of it under vine. And then obviously you've got fungicides, which are impacting on fungi populations for sure, can start to really change the dynamics of the field. I don't potentially think there's a true, it can't be that black and white. I think at the end of the day, as soon as you put a vineyard in, you are changing the ground.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think conventional, if you're managing it conventionally, you're having a bigger impact on the biology of that ground over saying organic or especially biodynamic or regenerative.
Cool.
Yeah.
And on that, if for example we had a set of terroir, your soil, where the USP would be chalk, let's say, like in Champagne, where I think chalk's USP, or all limestone's USP, is to make the soil a little more alkaline. If then you're applying synthetic nitrogen, which would heavily sway the pH, would it be worth still talking about the chalk?
I think, I think, again, you're talking about geology and you're talking about microbiology, and it can get confusing. So I think if we're talking it from a base soil, that base soil is not going to change, or that element is not going to change too much in terms of the terroir that it gives. But when we are talking about microbiology in the soil, the health of the soil, conventional is always going to deplete that, because it's going to basically cap it. You're adding massive fungicides, you're doing copper a lot, possibly even with organics, you're doing a lot of copper, which can have massive effects on the state of the soil and that kind of terroir driven presence. Personally, I think, the little you add, or the little disturbance you have in the ground is better. But again, regen, one of the big things about regen is cover crops and herbal lays, and then bringing in sheep or cattle or animals. You're then again starting to change the starting point you already had. Yeah. I think land, and it's funny, I talk about cork age quite a bit with wine, and wine is on a journey. Well, as soon as it goes into the bottle, that wine is on its own journey. A field is the same. As soon as you put a vineyard in, it's on its own trajectory and it's going somewhere else. It's just how you manage that trajectory.
Makes total sense. And I think regenerative farming, I find it quite tough to tell someone what it is in a nutshell. How would you explain it to someone who's never heard of it before in a small space of time?
I don't think there is an actual categorically definition for it. I see regen as more pragmatic rather than dogmatic. So organics, biodynamics, that's seen as very dogmatic. You have a very, very straight rule book. Conventional, you can do anything you want, and again, I don't think that's right. Regen is a balance. Okay, so, and the main starting point with regen is get the soil right. Okay, so you've got to think of it as tiered systems. I mean, it's the easiest way to think of it. If you have the soil in the right place, you have a really active soil level in terms of its pH, active microbial life in terms of fungi, bacteria, even nematodes to a degree, and then you have probably soil proteins working in favor of you, so glomine, which is like a catalyst or a talking point or the communicator between mycorrhiza and, say, root zones. If that's all working, then the idea is that then feeds the plant and that plant then gets better. The more soil disturbance you do, like tillage or adding in drift from fertilizers or fungicides, you then deplete that soil. And the idea of regen is we keep that soil living as best we can, keep it green, keep it living, keep it working. And then the idea is we'll be able to feed the plant with whatever it's growing, whether it's arable crops, trees, orchards, vineyards. They can sustain themselves better, but then also for longer. I think, we have to see vineyards surviving even in cool climates or more difficult climates, surviving for longer, say 30, 40, 50 years. And still have a good yield, because yield is key, economically and sustainably.
And on yields, I think there's a lot of hesitance around even organics, because people are worried that they're not going to have the yields that they did in conventional farming. When you look at regenerative farmers like yourself and others, is there a direct reduction in yields with regenerative farming?
I think if you go cold turkey. So if you were saying running conventionally and then you went absolutely zero inputs and stopped, you would see a massive reduction in yields or quality potentially to a degree for 3-4 years, and then the system would start to kick in. And the idea is that soil would then start to really feed the vines would recover. It's a bit like a heroin addict. If you take away the drugs, or drug addict or an alcoholic, if you take away the input, they will deplete, but the body will recoup, and that's the same for a vineyard. The vineyards will rebalance. You'll start to see carbohydrate reserves hopefully come up through the plant system because they've got a better network in terms of their roots and that active soil level. And then the idea is you'd see better bud formation or better inflorescence formation year on year, and eventually your yields would reach where you were with conventional.
Yeah.
I would always stress, and especially in this economic climate, phase it. Don't stop.
Don't go cold turkey.
I mean, unless you've got the funds. If
Okay.
you have the funds to do it, do it. It's the right thing to do. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Life finds a way.
yeah.
Tell me.
Yes, so it's usually accepted that nutrient status in the soil is also linked to how many nutrients are accessible for yeast during fermentation. So could you say there's a link between regenerative farming and maybe having to add less yeast nutrients during fermentation?
So Geisenheim has just done a study, a 10-year study, and about conventional organics, biodynamics, and I think they covered like integrated pest management or sustainable farming methods. The yields were under conventional were all lower,
Okay.
but in terms of YAN, there was a couple of A/B differences in terms of significance. So yes, there was
In the favor of organic and
more so
biodynamic.
biodynamics.
Yeah.
So there was a shift in YAN in the grape juice. So that's interesting. A difference also in phosphorus and a little bit of N as well in terms of the makeup. But what I would be more keen to do, and they've done this a lot in arable, is actually understand the nutrient differences in terms of crops. So like wheat crops grown conventionally against regen, the arable crops seem to have a lot more nutritional benefit that can then go into the food chain. I just wonder if there's something that we can look at that in grapes, and whether that then plays into a different level of like phenolics and composition that way.
Super. Thank you. Sigrid, I have a question for you from Charlotte Gibbs on social media, who's one of our guests at the bar, and I'm very proud that she asked this question because it's such a geeky one. Charlotte says, the latest data suggests that biogenic amines, like histamines, produced during fermentation are more likely to trigger hangover-related headaches than low levels of the sulphites found in most wines. Should the industry shift its labeling focus from may contain sulphites to biogenic amine content?
So you wanted us to keep it short. I'll say yes. Biogenic amines in some people cause allergic reactions, and these biogenic amines also have a sensory impact. So biogenic amines are histamine, as you mentioned, and that causes reactions in terms of red cheeks, flushed feelings, headaches, etc. But there's also biogenic amines like cadaverine and other lovely aromas that are not wanted in wine. And these are caused by some bacteria that are able to produce these biogenic amines. The amount of sulfite that can cause an allergic reaction is in the population is really quite low. But we're not doctors, so we're not trying to, but the indication, if you were to, for example, eat some apricots on the way to the tube, they would have far more sulfite than the typical wine that is labeled and giving you the impression that it's quite toxic. The amount of sulfite that we produce ourselves in our own biological systems, or even the yeast produced during a fermentation, can be quite low. So even a fully non-SO2 biodynamic organic producer, they could still have to label their wines because the yeast perhaps have produced some SO2. So in the big picture, I think the reducing the biogenic amines on a sensory level and also on a health of the product level is far and away more important to the consumer. And we can show that there's many times where people have felt they have headaches, and we know that the producer is doing a spontaneous malolactic fermentation that more than likely has caused those, where the different organisms that are checked for that don't produce biogenic amines will tend to produce zero, and also therefore produce a more fruity final product. So the bacteria are just as much an ally as the yeast in that case.
Super.
But yes, the biogenic amines are far more a culprit than the sulphites.
Thank you. Any questions on that at all before we keep going?
Can you put a number on that at all? So I think I've read somewhere like 1% or something of people is sensitive, particularly sensitive to sulfites. Can you put a percentage on like histamines or?
No, because in the big picture, it's an evolving thing. So, for example, if you look at some of the scientific papers, it can be women over a certain age. I'm going to say the number 40. So, as the human organism is evolving in terms of different levels in our lives, then there can be a tendency in certain ages to be more sensitive to biogenic amines at different times. So, okay. But it can also be men as well. But we've often seen that in more specifically. But yes, the amount of people that are allergic to sulfites is really quite low. But there are sensitivities, and then there's allergic reactions that can be anaphylactic. So there is an urgency in some people to be aware of it. But that percentage of anaphylactic versus sensitivity, etc., is quite low.
Understood.
I think even from personal level, as a hay fever sufferer, the difference between malolactically fermented wines versus wines that haven't been through mallow have a huge part to play with. My nose immediately blocking because of hay fever per se, and all of the wine people in the audience, I'm sure a quarter of you probably suffer from hay fever. This is a cool one to know.
It can trigger it. Yeah.
Sietze, last question from round one. Lucy Spain asks on email, how much of tasting is biology versus culture/language? And Lucy, this is coming from someone who's moved to the UK from the US, where blackberries were once outlawed, apparently. So she's never tasted blackberry.
That was blackcurrant actually, but I think the point of it was some things are just not available in certain countries, and especially like from a wine education perspective, all the important bodies like the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, Court of Masters Sommeliers, Institute of Masters of Wine, they're all they have their roots in England, right? So their terminology is around gooseberry, elderflower, and pear drops. And someone from the US is like, what are these things? And but the interesting thing, you can look up what the aromatic compounds are that causes an elderflower aroma, for example. And when you present that very compound to someone from the US, you're getting a different response. So, and that's what I do in my courses as well. So someone from the US is more likely to say passion fruit. Someone from the Dominican Republic will tell you it smells of guava. And someone from South Korea will say it smells of cassia seeds. And you're probably like, cassia seeds, what are those things? But they contain the same compound. And of course, we have all these different associations based on what we're most familiar with. So yeah, totally. And I think like in the grand scheme of things, UK and US is probably still quite closely connected with what type of things we've eaten. So just to give you another example, the compound diacetyls produced during malolactic fermentation, right? And most people would describe that as the aroma of butter. Mm-hmm. If you present that to someone from India, they're more likely to say it smells of dahi. And dahi is this type of dairy product which is also fermented with the same type of bacteria. So it makes total sense, contains loads of diacetyl. Maybe they don't consume butter on a daily basis and they know what it smells like, but they might not be so familiar with it. And I've seen the same things. I present diacetyl to someone from China, and they say that smells like rice, which has been left open in a pan for 5 days, and you get the same bacterial growth, right? So completely, I'm fully on board with this person who has experience, and can be quite frustrating that you're like not aligned with what you're smelling. But yeah, we have lots of data to back that up.
With that in mind, if we wanted to create hypothetically a universal language around describing aromas and flavors in wine, do you think the key would be to learn the chemical names like diacetyl and is it for MMB?
Yeah. I would say no, because it's not very approachable, right? It scares people off. So what I personally do, I just pick the term that's most frequently mentioned. So for 4-MMP, I would pick passion fruit, but then I explain, well, some people detect it as elderflower or other descriptors. So I think just going for that single descriptor is probably the best way going forward. Yeah,
Super.
and not chemical names.
Cool. Thank you. Any questions before we go on to round 2? Tell me.
Thanks. Yeah. When a young wine starts its journey, as Luke says, in the bottle and expresses himself well when it's young, and then it shuts down and for a time period isn't so interesting, a kind of teenage adolescent phase, then it comes out again brilliantly tertiary, lovely, an old wine. What's happening to the chemistry of the wine when it shuts down?
Okay, let me try to formulate an answer on that. For a start, I would actually like to see some data that effect actually exists. So I would love to see a sensory study where they have those 3 categories of wines and then demonstrate that there is indeed a lower perceived quality or something like that. I'm kind of improvising a little bit on the spot, I have to say. So like in development of what we see during bottle aging, there's several effects. So one example is tannins clustering together, which affects mouthfeel mostly. There is color pigments breaking down. So over time, color pigments, they don't have any aroma by themselves, but their breakdown products can have aromas. There is oxidation happening as well. So certain compounds turning into oxidative aromas. And then there's the disappearing of aromas, mostly the fruity and the floral aromas that tend to fade. So I can see why a hypothesis would be that the disappearance of fruity and floral aromas happens at a certain point. And by then, the attractive aromas that are forming from color pigment degradation, for example, have not yet appeared. So maybe it is not yet at that stage where it becomes more attractive. But intuitively, I would kind of expect them to go in the same sort of linear way. So I'm not fully happy with my own explanation, to be honest. But that's probably we need to look for it in that kind of direction.
On the question, are you saying that there's a young, vibrant wine period, and then a complete disappearance of the wine, and then it picks up again? Is that the observation?
Not a complete disappearance, but it's often something that wine critics talk about. Jasper Morris, he's quite a respected Burgundy expert, talks about this. Wines from the Rhone, especially white Rhones, Chateauneuf du Pape, they can be very delicious in one way when they're younger, and very interesting and complex when they're older, but there's a bit in between when people are less inclined to open them. The other thing I want to ask you about is on tannins, because I think this is a myth, isn't it? That tannins, the molecules get longer and slippery. Isn't that a myth, that actually the tannins break down, but they become more astringent as they break down, and it's only when they actually fall out of solution that the wine becomes softer and less tannic to feel?
So there's a science to that. Like if they are... So these would be phenolic compounds, right? Or more specifically, polyphenols. So it's like multiple phenols attached to each other. If it's just a single phenolic group, they actually can have smells. So for example, the vanilla smell is a phenolic compound. The clove smell, there's many different phenolic compounds. If they are polyphenols but shorter, they tend to be bitter. And then if they get a little bit longer, they become astringent, but more sort of sharp astringent. And then even longer, and it's still astringent, but a bit softer. But we do see an effect of the polyphenols binding together also with some color pigments. So yeah, there's some evidence for that.
I think to add on to that, polymerization, which you were describing, is measured in degrees of polymerization, so DP. When you're at sort of 2 to 4 in the chain, the tannins are small enough to physically fall into your bitter receptors on your tongue. Yeah. So they're tiny little things, they fall in and they trigger a response where you're like, oh, this is bitter. And those tannins are found in the seeds. They're found in very, very sort of early picked grape skins. And then with age or with ripening, they'll polymerize, get longer, and about 7 DP is when they're at their most astringent. So it's when they taste the most or feel the most grippy and, let's say, aggressive tannins. And then they get longer and longer until they become less astringent. But I think the falling out that you mentioned is when they link with anthocyanins, which are the color compounds in the wine, which are also part of the same family of flavonoids, because they can link and bind together. And what will happen is they'll precipitate out of the wine. But in terms of the tannins and the mouthfeel themselves, they'll go through a spectrum of change of becoming bitter, physically grippy and astringent, and then super, super smooth. Does that answer your question? Super. Any other questions before we move on to round 2? Round 2 is essentially questions. So we've got 2 up there. And anyone could just put their hand up and ask a question as we go. So Stuart, is it this Stuart? Love it. How do you approach the tricky topics of how science is going against traditional wine knowledge and even disproving certain very grounded topics in wine?
So I asked this mainly because the whole scientific principle revolves around disproving itself often. We take one thing that we knew was factual in science. Later down the line, we discover that maybe it wasn't quite correct. We found a new thing about that. And there's a lot of knowledge in wine, which is based around our perception of things, how we've tasted things over time. And now we're in an era where we understand wine on a microbiological, like, tiny level. We understand things way more than we did before. And there's certain things that maybe, I don't want to say we were making up, but weren't necessarily quite what we thought. So, for example, minerality. The use of the word minerality is a big one. People use that word, but how the heck do you even describe what minerality is? And are we actually tasting the soil? Science is maybe saying yes and no. Yeah.
Great question. Do you mind if I just tackle minerality? Because it's a lot to unpack there. I leave it to the panel. What do you guys? What is your take on minerality? Do we taste it? Is it a thing?
I think they've gone away from using minerality, haven't they, in the tasting circles? You'd probably be the best one. Isn't it more of a...
It's not cool anymore?
No, I think they're using other words to get away from using minerality because people don't lick stones and think, oh, it's a stone.
Yeah.
I think there's other descriptors that are being used compared to versus minerality.
As the panel, have we stopped using the word minerality? I still do, but I feel old-fashioned now.
Yeah.
I quite like Flint. I think Flint is a good one.
But isn't Flint falling into the same trap as Flint doesn't taste like anything?
It's an aroma.
Yeah. It's especially struck Flint, right? But it still sounds like a rock. So you're still doing the people that like the mineral term a favor.
What are our thoughts on minerality?
Saltiness is being used as well.
Like salinity.
Salinity is being used as well. So I think that's sort of the direction. There's a difference in terminologies, I think, is what's being used.
And Sigrid, do you have a take on a wine being saline or salty? Is it salty?
So that, in my perception, and I'm not a super taster in any way, I think it's more that sort of, the bigger element is that crispiness that's coming through. Because I think when we're doing cooking, etc., when you're adding a little bit of salt, you're enhancing flavors. But that's very much my personal one. I think as an aroma scientist, you'd probably be much more into it. I think that's,
Yeah, sure. And I was actually judging some Syrah wines 2 weeks ago. So one of the famous salty wines, right? And I think when you come across a wine like that, the first thing you should do is pinch your nose and taste the wine. And I think that's a nice way of telling whether a sensation you're getting is a taste sensation or an aroma. If you're pinching your nose, you're only getting the basic taste sensations. And with many of those salty wines, then there's no salty sensation. So that tells you it's probably not actual salt that's in the wine. Now, there have been like some anecdotes of sea salt blowing into open tank fermenters that are placed outside, and that might happen with like very rare scenarios. It is possible. But we also know that, especially during lees aging, some of the yeast can release a certain type of acid called succinic acid. I don't know if you've tried it. It has this sort of umami / salty aroma to it, and taste. Sorry, and I feel like certain yeast-derived aromas can also enhance that sensation. We know that if aromas are in line or like congruent with taste sensations, they can enhance each other. So my idea is that it's a combination with like low levels of succinic acid, which is basically yeast material, combined with certain fermentation-derived aromas that gives this salty impression.
Super interesting too is that as we've, and I would have to say that I think, from my perspective, I think the science is coming in tune with the traditional elements because there's more of an understanding of why those traditional elements were working or not working. So for me, I mean, even if we're looking today, we're allowed to use non-Saccharomyces yeast. So the superstar in fermentation is a yeast that's called Saccharomyces. And more recently, we're able to use non-Saccharomyces strains of yeast and that's been approved in the wine world. And they can add some really distinct characteristics, and one of them is this salinity that can be really interesting. So I think that this tradition and science are linking in many ways, in exploring some other ways of getting these aromas and more longevity in aromas. As you were mentioning, some of these aromas with different yeast can last longer and perhaps make that sort of that hole in the middle less distinct, which is also, I think, the fascinating part about science.
We have one more question before we have to break up. So on the board, anonymous. Does the anonymous person want to stay anonymous, or it's possibly not? Okay. So does taking an antihistamine tablet or medication help protect against the negative effects of biogenic amines when drinking wine?
I would say yes. Depending on the level that those bacteria have contributed, but certainly it will avoid some of the most serious effects of the histamine being in your body and your body trying to get rid of some of those histamines. But some wines are really quite high, so you might need to take 2 antihistamines, as you might in the hay fever season when it's the absolute peak of it. So yeah.
Super. Thank you so much. Can we have a massive round of applause to Luke, Sigrid, and Sietze for today? Thank you all for joining us. I have the guys' details on the board if you want to contact them with any geeky questions or for anything you may need. Please check them out. Hermione's going to want me to plug the book again. It's just over there to buy. Thank you all for joining me. Ciao.